Derek Willis is a news applications developer at ProPublica, focusing on politics and elections. He previously worked at the New York Times and at the Washington Post and at the Center for Public Integrity and Congressional Quarterly in the Palm Beach Post. And he's also co-founder of Open Elections, a project to collect and publish election results for all 50 states. I brought Derek on to talk about two COVID-specific data sets, one that he built dealing with federal contracts on COVID spending, and then then one that he has used and amplified, the PPP data, which we talked about last week, and he's going to talk about it some more and talk about how they use that data. I also like Derek to talk about the techniques that are involved, because he is a investigative reporter and also a supreme data whiz. So he can talk about techniques and the platforms that he uses, not to necessarily teach you all the what you need to know about Python in 60 minutes or less, but at least give you a sense of what is available out there and what is possible. And so then going to learn R or Python or Ruby or one of the other ones, other languages down the road, is just something you can start to think about if you're not already familiar with that. So and then the third key reason I'd love to have Derek on is because ProPublica's mission is to make this data available for all. And so the databases that he's developing, you in your newsrooms are able to use as well. So Derek, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. And hello, welcome. I mean, welcome to me, I guess. You've been here, right? So yeah, my name is Derek Willis. And as Chris said, I have worked at and left many of the finest news organizations in America. I'm currently at one, which is also a pretty good news organization in ProPublica. And you probably have heard of us, but just in case, essentially our shtick is that we are accountability folks. And a lot of our work involves essentially assessing what the government is doing or has done and trying to figure out if it's harmed people. And so those are kind of our two pillars: accountability and harm, really, for lack of a better term. And so when we look at government data spaces, we're interested in sort of like the broad question of how things are going, how this is working. But really what we're looking for is we're looking for outliers. We're looking for unusual circumstances. We're looking for things that are, frankly, are newsworthy. And for us, it's never like, it's never when we call someone and say, hey, it's Derek from ProPublica and I'd like to talk to you for the story, it's very rarely that I say, and it's good news. Like, it's almost never good news, right? It's always like, we're ProPublica, you kind of know how this is going to go. But that said, as Chris said, the data sets I'm going to talk about are all available because they're federal government data sets, but also we've tried to make them a little bit more consumable by the public and reporters. And for everything that I'm talking about here, if you are interested in like a slice of it that pertains to a particular geography or a particular time period or industry, just shoot me an email and I'm pretty sure we can make that happen, because we've done that for folks in the past and would love to do it for folks in the future. So I'm going to share my screen to kind of introduce the first one, which is our what we call our coronavirus contracting database. And this was my first introduction, my first large-scale introduction to federal contracting data when we put this together last year. And really, like a lot of folks, we found ourselves kind of scrambling right at the top to say, like, okay, so the government's going to just throw a bunch of money out the door. Where is it going to go? And you can try to track that in a couple different ways. You could try to sort of consume the fire hose, as it were, but really, they put out so much money, started spending so much money so quickly right after the middle of March, that doing that like on the way that you would check in with like regular sources or sort of a regular part of beat reporting just became unsustainable. And so what we needed to do is we need to put this data together in a place where we could ask questions of it. And so initially, before we published this data set at the end of May, we did it internally. Like we built a database and then let our reporters kind of take a look at it. And what we were looking for really are kind of like I said, the outliers. So we were looking for like, big contracts, right? We're looking for contracts that were for hundreds of millions of dollars. We're looking for agencies that were taking the lead on federal spending, or agencies, frankly, like the VA, that were just issuing like thousands of contracts. And the VA became a focus of our reporting because of their contracting behavior, frankly. Now, they have a lot of different locations around the country, obviously, and the VA also has a very specific mission in terms of providing healthcare. But they also were unusual and have been unusual in their contracting behavior, which kind of drew our attention. And the other thing is basically just to look at the contracts, to give us a chance to actually see like what kinds of things the federal government was spending money on. This is, we updated the database this morning. And so like, this is literally the latest data from the federal government, which may seem a little weird in the sense that like, okay, so like we've got stuff from this week for sure, but we also have stuff from a year, literally almost a year ago, that's just popping up in the system now. And we learned about that, and folks, those of you who have ever covered the Pentagon are probably familiar with this, but the Pentagon takes its time to report contracting data, and not just simply because it wants to. There's a minimum of a 90-day delay before defense contracts become available in federal contracting data. And that's a minimum. COVID has basically pumped that up to, as you can see, in some cases, nearly a 12-month delay in reporting of contracts, which makes things harder to track, obviously. But other agencies are pretty good at getting their contracting information in the data right away. And luckily for us, the health-related agencies, CDC, Indian Health Service, the VA to a certain extent, HHS, were all pretty quick about doing this. And so one of the things that we would do is we would just, as reporters, like just sift through the latest contracts every morning, and kind of in a group setting, virtually, obviously, but like, looking at a page that looked a little bit like this, and kind of like looking, scrolling down and just being like, okay, what do we see that's, that's interesting or weird or raises some questions? And at first, we didn't really know what we were looking for. And so we would gravitate toward weird things. I, for example, instantly today gravitated to this contract where the Army War College is doing some Lego play as part of their wargaming scenarios, which actually doesn't seem all that weird at all to me on second thought. But like, they signed a contract a year ago to like have somebody come in and do some wargaming stuff involving Legos. So, not exactly COVID sort of related or directly related to COVID, but I'll explain why it's in this data set in a second. What we ended up seeing though, was we ended up seeing a lot of like companies that we were pretty sure we would see. Companies that do deal with masks, and companies that make other, things that were kind of necessary and important to the COVID response effort. But what we also saw was a lot of contractors where we had never like heard of these folks before, that they were just completely like a mystery to us. And in fact, we ended up like focusing on sort of first-time vendors, because like first-time vendors got like literally billions of dollars in contracts, and some of them were pretty substantial contracts. So like this Parkdale Advanced Materials was like more than $500 million contract. But some of these folks were companies that, like Parkdale Advanced Materials is like they do apparel. They're an existing company in Gastonia. They've been in business for a long time. They just hadn't been a federal contractor before. A lot of these companies, though, are new companies in the sense that, like, not only are they new to the federal contracting game, they're just new. And that was like a really sort of interesting angle for us to start exploring. And so we started looking at essentially like, well, how do you go from not existing to getting a federal contract during an emergency sort of scenario? And it turns out one of the ways to do that is if you know people in the government. And so like we wrote a story about a former deputy chief of staff to the president who registered an LLC using his own name. His name was Zach Fuentes, and his LLC was Zach Fuentes LLC, and registered. And 11 days later, he had a $3 million contract. And so, like, that's pretty good if you can get it. But like, obviously, like, we had some questions about that. And in particular, you remember, like a year ago, like the scramble to get masks was insane. I mean, both like at a personal level, but also at a governmental level. The government, these agencies who needed to procure masks were literally just scrambling around and giving money to almost anybody who would promise them the chance to get masks. As it turns out, Fuentes did obtain masks, but they weren't suitable for medical use. And so he delivered them to the Indian Health Service. They just couldn't use them in any of their hospitals, which is not a great outcome for the Indian Health Service or for the taxpayer. And so we wrote several things about essentially how you can, if you knew people, or if you had some connections, or if you could even plausibly suggest that you might be able to obtain masks, the government would be like, sure, let's give it a shot. Let's try. And so oftentimes they would buy masks from China without even knowing who they were being made by. And so like the guarantees of like how effective they were pretty flimsy. And so like that sort of panic buying thing was one of the things that once we started pulling on that thread, you could see more of that. So I want to stop and talk a little bit about sort of how we got this data in the first place and how you could actually get this data for any sort of government contracting scenario. You may be familiar at the basis, like with the basics of this, but there's a site that has a wonderfully like 1990s or maybe late 80s look to it. This is like your classic federal government site, right? Like this is like, it's called the FIPIDS, the Federal Procurement Data System, but it has next generation next to it. So like, you know that it's, you know, technically really, really modern and up to date, right? And so like the good news about this site is that when they say a Google-like search to help you find federal contracts, like they're not kidding. Like if you wanted to do like Zach Fuentes, you can do that. And lo and behold, Zach Fuentes shows up and there's his $3 million contract with the Indian Health Service. As it turns out, he's actually had a couple of smaller contracts as well, but not really, and got a recent one for like $100 or so from a Federal Bureau of Prisons. Hasn't had a big one since. But you can kind of see and be like, okay, like it's a nice search engine. I would actually recommend exploring the search engine just to see how it works and how it responds to you. The trouble for us was essentially we wanted to know all the new contracts every day. And so we didn't really want to like, and if you want that, you can kind of search by date. You can, you know, say, okay, well, I can do like essentially the date the contract was signed, and I could do, you know, Wednesday to Thursday, right? And I could do that, and it would give me 9,000. So like there's 9,000 federal contracts that have been signed in the last 2 days. Well, that's a lot. And then many of them have nothing to do with COVID. Many of them are just sort of other kinds of contracts. And so our challenge was how do we narrow it down to know, to be able to look at what we want. And as it turns out, FIPIDS actually, the government actually thought of this and kind of has that, has planned for this kind of stuff. What they have is codes that are specific to certain circumstances. And so like when there is a disaster, like a hurricane, earthquake, something like that, that sort of triggers a series of federal expenditures, or COVID for that matter, they'll assign a code to it. And on this page, it's called a National Interest Action Code. And the COVID one was just called P20C for reasons that I'm sure someone in the federal government can explain. But that's how it started out. And so what we could do is we could literally search FIPIDS for that action code, right? And so we could say like, okay, well, national interest code, P20C. And then, okay, so like we're like down to 86 over the past couple days. And like that's more manageable. Like we can look at that and be like, okay, if we wanted to scroll through that, we could. But here's where we kind of ran up against like another barrier, which was in the early days of the pandemic, like it wasn't 86, it was like hundreds of contracts, and some days thousands of contracts. And so scrolling through those, not a great idea. So the government offers us some solutions. One of them is like, we could print all of these out as a PDF. That's not a solution. Don't ever do that. Like literally don't ever click on this PDF button. Like it works, but you'll regret doing it. So don't do that, right? Like PDFs aren't data for you, right? There's a CSV button. And if you're not familiar with CSV, it's just simply basically an Excel file. So like if we click that, we get a CSV file, which is great, except that the contents of that file, like here's for example, is what happens when you click on like the view, like a single contract. And like there's a lot of information in here, including helpfully the email address of people who actually work on contracting systems. They're not super responsive because that's not their job, but it's helpful to have those emails sometimes. But there's a whole lot of information about like the contract itself, where the work is being done, in Washington's 4th District, for example, all sorts of interesting and useful information. Unfortunately, when you hit the CSV button, you don't get that. You get some of it, but you don't get all of it. And so the CSV button is not great for that reason, right? And so the issue there is essentially, how do we get actual data? So I seem to have just kicked myself off of the search page I was on, unfortunately, but let me get back to it. So if I redid my Zach Fuentes search, the last of the like export buttons is this weird thing called Atom, and it is how we actually ended up building this database and automating its updating. And so if you click the Atom button, you probably will recoil in horror, as you sort of should as a first reaction. This is something called XML. And XML is terrible but useful. And governments use it a lot because it is a good way to store information that is variable. In other words, information where you could have some of the fields are filled out, but some of them are not, or some of them are filled out some of the time and others are not. But when we stumbled upon this, like it has all of the information that the detail page of a contract has. And that's super useful because the difference here is that like, I don't have to like, it's all like, it looks like a mess, but it's literally all contained between tags. So like the total obligated amount, I know where to find this in the XML. And more important, I can tell a computer where to find it so that I don't have to manually do it. That I can just simply run a script and it goes and grabs this particular URL, this Atom feed, and it then goes and then pulls out the data that we want and inserts it into a database. And I want to say one more thing about that, about the utility of that versus looking at these individual pages. These individual pages are good to look at. You can print them out. They provide helpful, like somewhat more useful labeling and context. But if you go up and actually copy the URL and then like send it to someone, when they click on it, it doesn't work, which is great. I mean, it's not, it's terrible. So like those URLs are temporary basically, and based on your browsing session. Whereas the Atom feed is not temporary. It sits there and you can also ask questions of it. There's like this Atom feed is literally just for the search results for Zach Fuentes. If I change that Atom feed to do Parkdale, if I change the URL, I get different results. And so it is a database. You just have to know how to query it and then and how to handle what are the results of it. And so I want to just sort of I don't want you to look at XML, basically. Like nobody should. It's not meant to be looked at. It's meant to be sort of consumed by a computer. And I will, fairly confidently tell you that in your organization, even it's a very small one, there's probably somebody, and maybe it's just the person who deals with IT issues, who knows what XML is and how to consume it because they have to for their job. And so like the good news is that this is like, in some respects, a solved problem. It's not a solved problem for you yet, because we got to get, sort of like you're standing here, the data is is over there. We got to figure out how to close that gap. But other people have solved this problem, and it's closer. That gap is smaller than you think. But the other thing I want to say about this is that like you can set this up so that like this kind of feed, this Atom feed, you can actually, as a first step, if you're using a software that consumes RSS feeds, which is what we used to do back in the day to like keep tabs of websites, Atom feeds are comparable to that. And you can just plug in a URL, a contracting URL into an RSS reader, and it will then, when there are new contracts, it will then show you in your reader what those new contracts are. And so like, if you're like, whoa, Derek, I'm not going to go the database route just yet. That's fine. That's fine. Perhaps I can entice you into just simply subscribing to a search result from FIPIDS that will let you know that's keyword based, that might, sort of pop up and be like, oh, hey, there's a contract for this organization that's in our circulation area or in our district, or is a company that we just need to pay attention to. And so I want to, the thing I want to say about contracting data in itself is that it's still kind of a mess, and not just visually. It doesn't answer a lot of questions, right? And so like, there's, Rachel in the chat basically saying like, how do you figure out like problems in a contract delivery and what the problems were? And the answer is like, the data is not going to tell you that. It's going to provide some hints to that possibly, but it's not going to tell you that. And so there are a couple of things that we have learned to do in doing stories with this data. One is that you FOIA the contract documentation. Like now, that's going to take some time depending on the agency, but they do respond. And like you want to find like, essentially you want to ask for the RFP if you don't already have that. And there are a lot of places there are some places you can get that, but you want to ask essentially for what they asked for and then what they got back, right? And so you want to FOIA that. And then the other thing is you want to call people who likely would, like who the winning bidder on this. And you might not be able to see who actually bid on this, like the losing bidders. But if you know who the winning bidder is, like person who got the organization that got the contract, you can probably make some guesses as to what industry they're in and who their peers are. And then you give them a call and be like, hey, were you in on this? Did you bid for this contract? Are you aware of this contract? And they can kind of tell you sort of ins and out of what that process is like. The people who are regulars, government contractors, like they know what this is like and they can describe when there are anomalies to you. We talk to a lot of folks who were longtime government contractors in order to understand what was going wrong with first-time government contractors. And I would recommend that. So, yeah.
We have a couple of questions in. I guess were you getting ready to move on to the PPP?
Yeah, but I see like there's a couple essentially. Yeah,
we can maybe take those contracting questions before we move on to something else. We have David, Rachel, who you kind of addressed, and then Amy. So maybe David, can you just restate your question for Derek?
Sure. Yeah. So my question is, when it came to these, examining these newly established companies receiving the funds, why did alarm bells ring that there might be something, kind of shady behind it? Not necessarily assuming that, but like why look there first? Or did you just look everywhere and then you began to just kind of narrow the focus on these newly established companies?
What we did, one of the things we did was we talked to essentially folks who study government contracting, and basically we said like, hey, when there's like an emergency, when it's like a, sort of panic, where are the weak points, and or what happens, and what one of the things that folks told us was new people rush in because they sense an opportunity that wasn't there before, and then also, and they said that it'll be even doubly so for a situation like COVID, because like businesses were shutting down or closing, and then, but wait, there might be an opportunity to get federal government work, right? And so like people were repurposing, you had breweries making hand sanitizer, like folks were looking for ways to pivot. And so that Venn diagram essentially of like, are you new to federal contracting? Are you new entirely? Like, are you just a brand new company? And then like, is this the work that you normally do? And if somebody like checks all those boxes where it's like new to federal contracting, relatively new company to begin with, and then no track record of doing that work before, that was a good heuristic.
And just a really quick story. Did the conversation, did you reach out to the experts first, or did you sort of like do like the initial work?
We sort of did the initial work, and then when we saw things that like we thought might be weird, we were like, well, let's see if other folks think they're weird, and they did. So, yeah.
David, just FYI, David is from Gothamist and WNYC. Let's go to Rachel. Rachel, did he address your question? Or you still have more?
I'm dealing with a situation on the local level where a company is a first-timer company that has gotten a huge amount of our County CARES Act dollars, and all the red flags are there. I mean, this company has a website that says a whole lot of stuff that means nothing. It did nothing before COVID. Suddenly it gets millions and millions of dollars to procure PPE from Southeast Asia, and no RFP that I know of. But the county's like, well, they did a great job. And I'm just trying to figure out where to go from there.
Yeah, I mean, so like if there's like if there are deliverables in the contract, essentially like what do they actually have to deliver? And just be like, okay, so what did they deliver? Like, can you show me evidence of what they delivered? And then the harder part is, when we're dealing with Indian Health Service contracts, is getting folks who are getting the PPE, like the frontline folks, to tell you about it, because it's risky for them, right? But like it's worth trying to see if you can do that, essentially to see if you can convince folks to at least say like, hey, like, did this work out for you the way you expected or the way you were told? Like how did this equipment show up? Like what are the packaging? Like literally for PPE, we would ask people to take pictures of it and share them with us, so that we could say like, how is this equipment packaged? Because like, if there's like nothing on the package or very little on the package, well, you can't really guarantee it is what they said it was, right? And so like focusing on the deliverables is what's really important here.
All right, so we have Amy and Rachana, and tell them what news outlet you're from.
I'm Amy Sherman at PolitiFact. On the ProPublica website, the type of vendors getting contracts, if your company falls under two categories, are you then counted twice? Like if I was writing about this, would I not want to say, oh, women-owned vendors was this amount, minority-owned this amount, because there could be some overlap there, or are they separate?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, it is there could be overlap in the sense that like you could be a first-time veteran-owned, women-owned minority vendor, right? And so like those are, yeah, like I think the appropriate thing to do there is try to treat them like as individual silos, because that's essentially what they are, because you definitely can be more than one of those categories.
And then when I clicked on foreign owned, it lists a bunch of addresses in the US. So that means
so like what it means is no, another good question. What it means essentially is that that's many of them have American subsidiaries or American based subsidiaries. And so like they are foreign owned in the sense that like the ultimate owner is, located overseas. Although I also wouldn't necessarily like some of these, like, just looking at that page, like Accenture Federal Services doesn't seem like it should be marked as foreign owned. And so like that could be bad data essentially, but they might be like Accenture's doing like, sort of a subcontracting deal or there's lots of weird stuff in this data that frankly is just produces more questions than it answers. But, and what we don't do is we don't go in and like edit the data. Essentially, like whatever they report to the government is what we display. And so the only thing that we've added to this data is determining the first-time vendors, because the federal government doesn't ask you that question. And so when we see a vendor, we check against FIPIDs to see, have these folks ever received a federal contract before? And if not, then we mark them as a first-time vendor. All the other ones are vendor-supplied information. And I should say, like, I can't stress enough like how nuts it was, especially last April, May, and June, in terms of like the information that was how many contracts were pouring through and the stress on federal contracting officers. And so, yeah, I'm sure there's information in here that like isn't 100% accurate, as with almost every federal database.
And Rachana.
Hi, I'm Rachana Pradhan with Kaiser Health News. I typed one question, but I realized I have another one. So
Sure.
one thing is real quick is it clear through the procurement database whether something was no bid or not?
Yeah, and so it is like in the detail page, it'll of a contract and in the data itself, it'll say essentially the extent competed is how they phrase it, and it'll have like, oh, it could be full and open competition. No, it'll be like sole source, like literally this is the only place we can get this information, this product from. And then it'll also have like essentially the solicitation procedures. So those two things, essentially extent competed and solicitation procedures, will tell you whether or not it was a no bid contract, whether or not it was sole source. And like sometimes sole source stuff is totally understandable. Like there's only one person or one company that makes that specific product. And so therefore like there's no bidding. But other times, like we found a lot of like PPE no bid contracts for masks. It's like, okay, well, that might raise some questions.
Right. Just one other real quick thing is, now, did you all have any luck at all actually, through FOIA trying to get the actual contracts?
Some luck. The good news essentially is that if you're already familiar with FIPIDs, and you can see the award ID that they use, it's very hard for them to be like, we don't know what you're talking about. It's very hard for them to be like, your request isn't specific enough. If you say I want the contract for this award, the problem we would occasionally run into is to be like, well, it's you might start out sending it to HHS's main contracting office. And then they'd be like, no, it wasn't our office. It was this field office. And then it gets kicked around. This happens a lot with VA as well, because they have regional contracting offices. And so finding out which contracting office it came out of can speed things up a little bit. I am also still waiting on contracts that I have FOIA'd last year.
Right. Yeah, no, you've re-inspired me to write HHS today about one thing where it was the same thing. I thought, how long can they ignore this? Because I have the number, but nothing yet. So, but thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay, so one final question from Yamil, and then we'll go on to the PPP. Yamil, you just want to ask yours?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute.
Okay.
Just real quick, just how you guys found people, where you went to look for people who could walk you through, what's typical in a government contract, what are the red flags? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So for PPE, we went to people who previously had provided PPE to the government. Because the hospital, VA and HHS, CDC, they buy PPE, just not nearly as much as they did. And so we talked to folks who were suppliers previously, and who were more than happy to be like, yeah, some of these folks like this is crazy, and like some of these operators are sketchy and fly by night, and like, you know, like they were more than happy to dump on people who are doing some weird stuff there. And there also is like a whole set of academics who study government contracting, and public policy folks, and like they were also pretty helpful in sort of helping us to understand what was going on, like how we should, like how we could calibrate our, is this normal, is this abnormal, you know, sensibilities. And I will say this about those folks, they were like most academics, if they have a niche specialty, they don't talk to a lot of reporters a lot, and they usually are more than happy to tell you in great detail about their about what they know. And so like we would, you know, we'd do the usual thing of being like, you know what, treat me like I know nothing about this. And you have a long phone call, but it's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, so I guess PPP.
Okay, so our second project, like data project, and let me share my screen here, involves like the PPP program, which was again like started up last year to provide aid mostly to small businesses, although that definition of small business is a little fungible under the law, but it has done that. Like it's hard to say that this program actually didn't at least meet a lot of the goals, which was essentially just to get cash out to a lot of people. We updated this morning. The SBA, the Small Business Administration, which provides this data, they update their data every month now. They didn't do that last year, but now they're on a regular schedule of updates, which is very helpful and consistent. There's a lot of data here. We're up to like more than 10 million loans that have been approved. We're really specific about the language here because in this database, because essentially what the SBA releases is a list of loan applications that have been approved, which is not, we found out, the same thing as being actually the money being paid out. Because the process here for PPP was also incredibly rushed, in the sense that like the goal was just literally just get this money out the door as quickly as you can. And so lenders would sort of kind of tee up the paperwork and be like, okay, do you want to apply for one of these things? I got the paperwork ready to go. And the SBA and the lender would be like, we're essentially like, if you had an existing business relationship, you have a banker, they could just get that done really quickly. And they would be like, we're going to just pre-approve this because you've been a client of ours, you're a customer of ours, we know you, you're good for this, right? So that happened a lot, where essentially folks applied for loans or filed paperwork for loans and then decided not to take the money. So you'll see that in the data essentially, and they will say, like, for example, the status will be something like not fully dispersed. And that usually means is that like either one of two things. That means that either the person withdrew, you know, essentially decided not to take the money, or the organization decided not to take the money, or, and this was the more interesting one to us, is they didn't apply for this loan, somebody else did, and they used their information. Now, I don't want to overplay this because it's, like I said, it's like 10 million loans, but and if you talk to folks who are involved in this program or who study it, there's always some amount of fraud built into government programs like this. They basically just sort of like count on it. The question, and what we don't really know for sure, is how much fraud. And this is where things kind of get interesting. A lot of the attention, and rightfully so initially, was on like the larger loans, right? And so like if you had like here's this New York law firm, $10 million loan, right? So like that's a big loan. And like that was the maximum that you can get under PPP, under that first round. And initially, the SBA only released information on applicants who applied for loans of $150,000 or more. And that was about 600,000 initially. And so like that's the initial database that we published. And then a bunch of news organizations led by the Center for Public Integrity sued the SBA and said, okay, well, you're releasing only some of the information. The law is pretty clear about this all is public information, so you should release all of it. And the judge agreed, federal judge agreed. And so now we have every approved applicant, even if somebody applied for a loan for even a couple $100. And so the good news is that we don't have to jump through nearly as many hoops to build this as we did with the contracting data, because the SBA has this page on their website that every month they update this data. And it is, they break it out into multiple files. The first file is essentially all of the large, what they refer to as the large loans, the 150K and up loans. And then they break them out into smaller, in multiple files covering the small loans. And you can see, like, there are, for one file of the large loans, there are 11 files of smaller loans. And so, like, the vast majority of these loans are for less than $150,000. And you might sort of say, like, well, Derek, I mean, like, honestly, like, you know, who cares about loans under $150,000? Like, is this meaningful? And like, it's a fair question, especially in the context of like Washington, right? Where it's like, you know, $1 million, $1 billion, and pretty soon we're talking real money. But if you're gonna like try to defraud the federal government, like, you're a brave soul if you're going to start at the $1 million mark, right? Like, you know, essentially, like, that's going to draw more attention to yourself, right? And so, like, the space for fraud here is really in the smaller dollars, because what they're counting on is like the combination of both government regulators, lenders, and the public just not paying attention to that stuff. Like, that's where, you know, it's relatively easy. Like, that's where it seems easier to do. That being said, like, I'm not confident that like there weren't attempts at fraud in larger amounts. In fact, there's a really interesting story that some folks in a TV station in Indiana did like a month ago, which was, they noticed in our database that, like, hey, this large hospital in Fort Wayne applied for and was approved for like a $1.1 million loan. And then when they asked them about it, they're like, we didn't apply for that, which seems super weird. And like, if you read the story, it's like, it is super weird. And they basically said, like, we called the DOJ and the Small Business Administration to report suspected fraud, which that's kind of, I mean, like, that's kind of noteworthy that like somebody would apply for a $1.1 million loan in the name of a large hospital system. Like, that's, I mean, I guess I give them credit for like boldness, right? But like, if you want to actually do fraud, you probably are going to do it at a lower amount. I want to briefly just show you sort of what this data looks like. And it's nothing particularly scary. It's just, they're text files, they're spreadsheets, but they're just really large spreadsheets. So like, here's one of the files. It's and it's just a bunch of text. It's like a loan number, and it's got a nice header. Like, in theory, you could open this up in Excel. I wouldn't recommend it, because like this file is like 900,000 rows. So like, you know, don't treat your computer that way. Like, it's not, Excel's not really made for that. And that's why I said at the outset, like, if you're interested in looking at some loan, like some subset of loans, I'd be happy to carve that up for you and send it your way, because I've done that for other reporters. And that shouldn't be the barrier to you all like digging into government data, right? So one of the things that we first started to do when we put that database together was really to be like, okay, so who, you know, like how are people using this money, right? And so like one of the, initially, like we saw a lot of temp agencies getting PPP loans, and then like they were then also, you know, getting money, like getting hired to do temp work as well. And So like, it's a weird scenario because essentially they mostly claimed they were saving 500 jobs each, the maximum under the law, but they don't have 500 employees because temp agencies hire temporary employees. And so like, they were basically counting workers contracted by other companies as jobs that they were saving under the conditions for getting these loans forgiven. And so essentially some of them were able to double dip. So like, that's an interesting story. We've seen this data used in other places. There's a state rep who owned a steakhouse in Michigan who got fined for COVID violations, who also got a PPP loan. It provides a little bit of context. Maybe one of my favorites is, the YouTube stars who applied for PPP loans, because as we all know, what COVID did was it prevented us from making YouTube videos or being on screens a lot. That really shut down that. Actually, no, it didn't do that at all. But apparently, if you were an influencer, you could also get money. It is pretty remarkable the extent of businesses and individuals that apply for this for these loans, and so you can search through them. The caveats about this, though, data are much greater than they are for the contracting data. And I say that because this was also, in addition to being rushed, almost all of this information is self-reported. And so like there are a lot of folks who claim to be like, a certain kind of business that is definitely like an actual, like that industry exists, but it doesn't seem plausible for their location, right? Or you'll see folks who essentially like claim large numbers of employees, and it doesn't, if you know anything about that business, you'd be like, I'm not sure that's true. And so like, it's all like a self-reported thing. And as far as we can tell, the SBA doesn't really vet those in a serious way, because I don't think it has the capacity to do it. And frankly, I think some of the lenders don't have, not all the lenders, but like I think some of the lenders don't also have this capacity. And so you want to be skeptical about some of the claims, some of the information that's listed in these, and really try to follow up. For our purposes, like that's what when we report on these, we generally try to call as many recipients as we possibly can, or people who are approved to receive this money, because since we've launched this, we've gotten a stream of emails from people saying, I didn't apply for this. Like, that's my name and that's my business, or that's my line of work and that's where I live, but I didn't fill this out. And then sometimes they'll come back and be like, oh, my banker actually pre-filled it out for me and anticipating I'd want one. But sometimes they'll come back and say like, yeah, I definitely didn't do this, but I had my identity stolen. And so like, there are definitely some vectors here for bad actors. And I think like it's worth asking essentially for individual, like, for like the places, like the areas you cover and the industries you cover, essentially what their strategy was, like whether it's useful or not, like whether, who did and didn't take it and why, because I think it is an interesting choice. I mean, especially considering that nonprofit organizations, including churches, were eligible for PPP money. And so like we have a much wider array of potential recipients than just simply businesses. And so I think it has a lot of different lines of reporting. I want to very quickly just say about both of these databases. I mentioned that like they're both like fairly regularly updated. We update the government contracting data now twice a week, and we update the PPP loans once every month. And when I say we update them, I mean like I press a couple of buttons. And this is my sort of pitch for the geekier side of journalism, as Chris may have sort of hinted at. If you're doing something with a computer, if you're doing a manual task with a computer and it's repetitive, like you find yourself doing the same thing over and over the computer, I'm sorry to tell you, but you're using the computer wrong. Like that's not what the computer is for. And frankly, your time is more valuable than that. Like we are like, you know, higher end creatures in that sense, right? Like, don't do manual repetitive tasks with the computer. When you're faced with that scenario, you should ask yourself, is there a way I can automate this? Is there a way I can even partially automate it that will free me up to like do more important things or more useful things or things, frankly, that humans are better at? And that's how I got my start down this road of data journalism, is by automating tasks that I didn't want to do because they were just taking too much time. And that road to automation, like, it sounds like, okay, well, I don't have an engineering background. I majored in rhetoric, for God's sake, in college. Like, I was not anybody's idea of a computer software engineer, and I still am not. But the good news is that most of these like automation problems are also solved problems. Like, maybe not your specific, like the very specific context for you, but the general gist of what you're trying to do, other people have had this problem and other people have solved this problem. And you should happily build on or steal what they've done. And by steal, I mean just sort of like Google and look at what other people have done and try to do that. And you might actually find some success for that. It's not going to be easy or great all the time. You may not be successful in every instance, but it can make a large difference, because I don't have to spend time updating the database. I can now spend time thinking about how to ask questions of it that will get us stories. And so, like, I'm not just simply like shoveling data into something. I'm letting the computer do that. And instead, I'm spending my time trying to figure out, what can I ask of this data? How can I interview it so that it will give up the good stories for us? And I see Bridget's got a question.
Yes. Hi, I'm Bridget with CQ Roll Call. I was just had a quick question. Yes. I had a quick question about the database itself. When it says loan status, is that referring to whether it's paid out? And because I searched like quickly for a company that's owned by a candidate that just launched a race for Senate, and it says not disclosed. So I don't know if there's a way to find out if it was.
Yeah, so like, which is super annoying, because many of these loans have that status. I'm just gonna quickly show you the site where we get the data has this data dictionary file, which is a regular spreadsheet that you can just open up. And so I will, like, grab that and be like, hey, and then I'll switch my screen to Excel to share that. Sorry, hold on one second. And literally what it says is like, it provides a little bit of description, but basically we provide on our site a sort of cleaned up version of that loan status. But what it's talking about when it says, when it has like poses the question that you had, is essentially like, is what it's known as exemption 4. When essentially like they've withheld that information for business reasons. And the SBA does this for a lot of its loans, where they can just be like, the lender's like, or the applicant doesn't want to tell you what the status of it is for like competitive business reasons. We have not been successful in essentially like compelling the SBA or getting that information out of them, what the status is. What I can say is that there is a field in the data that says that shows what is called undispersed amount. And if that undispersed amount is 0, that suggests that the loan has been paid, that the money has been paid out. The question about the exemption, essentially, like they may be withholding that until or unless that loan is forgiven. That might be the case, but it also might not. It might simply be the applicant saying, for like business competitive reasons, I don't want to tell you. because we've heard that from people. Be like, like we get a lot of complaints about this database because like people email us and be like, I can't believe you posted this information. It's like my private personal information. And we're like, okay, well, but it's the government's money, so no. And like, I don't want people to know I got a loan. Like, well, I guess you should apply for private loans if you don't want people to know you got a loan then. But like is the glib answer. But like people are sensitive to that. And I think like people who have banks, like actual like established banks, are more likely to choose exemption, essentially to withhold that information. And I don't have a great answer, unfortunately. I wish I did. You can ask them, like you can ask like the recipient, hey, did you get the money? And there's your answer. And if they didn't get the money, like it's a good question as to like why the status is what it is.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. If any of you have one, hands up at all, anybody? Derek, one question I had for you, the PPP money, when somebody has, a lot of people got loans and then paid them back, how does that get reflected in the SBA data and in yours?
So these are essentially the options here are like you can get the loan forgiven, which means essentially like the government says, whatever, it's on us, right? Or you could not get it forgiven and have to pay it back. Or essentially like the loan is sort of charged off by the government as like a bad loan, which doesn't happen as often. The SBA is releasing aggregate stats on loan forgiveness. So far, they're not releasing information on a loan by loan basis on forgiveness. We are all very interested and curious as to whether they will do so, but they have not so far. And I'm not totally sure that they intend to.
Okay,
so you can go to their website and see like their PPP site and see like what percentage of loans overall have been forgiven. But right now, you can't find out from this data whether or not an individual loan has been forgiven.
Okay, I guess my question was dealing with the companies that last year took loans, like the Los Angeles Lakers, and then got all kinds of crap, and then gave them back. Is that like the LA Lakers loan? How is that reflected in the data?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, but like I think it would be reflected in that it would either be not fully dispersed, essentially. My understanding is essentially like they treat returned money as essentially an approved amount that was not fully dispersed. I'm guessing though that like it also could fall under that exemption 4 where they just don't tell you what the status of the loan is. And so it would be this is the frustrating part about this, because essentially to confirm it, you basically have to take the word of the recipient, and the lenders obviously have no interest in no interest in telling you whether or not they paid it out.
Actually, now that I mentioned the Lakers, what the SBA ought to do is just start to claim credit for helping the Lakers win the NBA title last year.
Yeah. I would.
They got their their PPP loan. They won the title. We
should have
helped support LeBron James, all of us together.
A little SBA badge on the Lakers website, or the uniform brought to you by the SBA,
So we had a question from Alex. Alex, you just want to ask the question?
Yes, thank you, Derek. So I cover state and local politics for the Portsmouth Herald up in New Hampshire. When I was reviewing that first, the 150,000 to 10 million loan information when that came out, I had seen a number of large employers in the state. They either left that retained employee section blank, or they reported not retaining anyone with their large loans. So I guess my question is, do you view that data's loan as enough to say that there was certainly plenty of abuse of from these large companies in the PPP? And then I guess if not, what else would you look at to potentially make that evaluation?
Yeah, this was a tough one because like originally we were very excited about that jobs reported number, which was then like changed to mean jobs retained. But honestly, like what I can tell you is that it appears that applicants interpreted that question differently, especially early on. And the SBA was essentially forced to like sort of say like, okay, well, this figure, which we call jobs reported, actually doesn't mean that. It means it doesn't mean like how many jobs you have. It means how many jobs were retained. But again, like I don't even know necessarily like that there's a single definition for that terminology. I think the intent of the application was to say like, how many people can you keep on the payroll with this money? And so for folks to say 0, yeah, like I have some questions about that, but I don't know that especially if they got a loan early on, I don't know that it's a slam dunk evidence of like something weird, something bad going on. But it certainly raises the question of like, you know, the SBA offers people the ability to correct the information in the data, but almost nobody knows about it. Like, and very few people seem to avail themselves of that option, or very few companies. And frankly, once you've gotten the loan and you feel you've satisfied the requirements of the loan, I'm not sure what incentive they have to actually correct that information in the SBA data. So it's not a great situation. Like we were really excited about like using that, like doing analysis on that data, and it's just not good enough to do. Like we were not confident at all that we could say anything of any real substance that we could rely on.